Okay, welcome back. So now for the next part, when we talk about information systems and obtaining them. So the first part we've talked about, building the business case and convincing people that we do need to do something. That is making the business case, that's recognizing that there is a decision to be made. So once people on board say, yes, we do need to do something, we need to have an information system, we need to take, we need to eliminate this threat or these costs, or we need to make use of this opportunity, or we need to increase our market share. You say, great, let's look at our options to do this. So there's different ways to do this, but that brings us to this next step of that decision-making process. You recognize there is a decision to be made, people agree. Now, what are our options? And these alternatives can be internally. You can do brainstorming sessions, what will be the options for it, or you can do external. You can look at competitors, you can look at innovations, you might be triggered by something in the news. But probably you're limited in the number of alternatives you can identify. You will look at alternatives that will fit within your organization. You will use financial constraints, you have time constraints, the technology, and so on. So there's a lot of alternatives that are possible, but as the process goes on, you will start narrowing down these alternatives. We're going to take a closer look at when we talk about alternatives in relation to information systems. So here I'm talking about alternatives for any decision. Again, going back to the example of getting on your bike, you might limit it because of technology, you have a flat tire, you might be limited by legal, moral, ethical considerations. For example, you don't want to harm the environment and you won't take your old car to work. But let's transition that to alternatives when it comes to alternatives for information systems. One alternative, one choice you have to make is when you start building information systems, and now I'm talking specifically about software for information systems, you have several options. One would be to build software yourself, completely custom. It's tailored to what you need, and you build it yourself, you design it yourself. The alternative would be is that you buy software that's already out there, so that it's packaged and that's ready to use. When we talk about custom software, the advantages are that it's custom made. You only pay for what you need. It's tailored to your situation. But the issue is the cost might usually be a bit higher. Off-the-shelf software is software that that's probably less costly because it's mass produced. You can just buy it, so the implementation is faster. It's usually of a higher quality because it has been developed for a longer period of time, and it has also less risks. So if you talk about custom software, it's really you hire developers or you have developers and you build your own systems. Off-the-shelf software, think about Microsoft Office, Dynamics, SAP, those kind of systems. You buy them and you could still configure them, but essentially you don't have to do the development yourself. And lastly, an option is, of course, outsourcing, either part of your IT development or completely outsourcing part of your business that deals with the information systems. So one is really more internal. The other one is working with external development. So if you talk about some options that you can use for internal development, or software that you can use. One of the common used elements is open source software. So open source software means that the code behind the software is available and you can use it and you can modify it. So if you start building your own systems, you can start from somebody else's software, you can take it, you can modify it. It often also means that the programs themselves are freely available, but it's not the same thing. Open source software and free to use software are not the same thing. So with open source software, we really mean that the source code is available for you to take and to modify. So Linux, the operating system, MySQL are examples of that. The advantage of open source software is that it's usually free. Does not necessarily mean, it does not necessarily have to be free, but usually open source software is free. But you also means that you're on your own. Open source software often does not come with support. You have to make changes yourself. There are companies that do offer support, but then you pay for it. So if you want to use, for example, Red Hat Linux, you can get customer support, you can get commercial grade support, but you will be charged a fee. Keep in mind that free software and again, open source software are not the same thing. Google Chrome, for example, the browser, you can install it for free, you can use it for free, but the source code, at least not all of the source code, is publicly available. People would also argue you're not paying, in dollars, but you're paying with your data when you use that software. So just keep in mind when we say open software, it means the source code is available. And why is that important? Because when the source code is available, software has the potential to be safer. Because it means that more eyes are checking the source code. If you talk about Linux, there's hundreds and thousands of developers around the world constantly looking to improve the software and to add their knowledge to it. So it's what we referred to in an earlier lecture about Wikipedia. It's the same idea with software. Everybody's contributing to improve it. There are even commercial incentives like bug hunting and bug bounty programs. The EU has added that as well. That encourages, that will pay you if you can find bugs in the software. So you can check the programming code. You can check if there is a way to misuse the software when it's installed or when it's running. So the idea of open source software, when we say it has the potential to be safer, means that you can verify its workings, you can make modifications, and other people are contributing to it. It does not necessarily have to be safer because, of course, if there is a flaw in the software or in the code, everybody will see it as well, which means it can be exploited. So it is whether you keep it public so people can help you fix, but also can see the flaws, or you keep it a secret and you hope with potentially nobody discovering it. And of course, it also depends if a lot of people are contributing it. Something might be open source, but if nobody's checking it and nobody's contributing or maintaining it, it doesn't have to be safer. So just to clarify that difference. However, open software development is more available than you might think. You might think about some tools that you use, some programs you have on your computer that are either free and or open source. But a lot of the software, even if it's commercial, even if you paid for it, is based on open source software. So there are a lot of toolkits available. So standard pieces of software, building blocks that are being used to build applications. I'll show you some examples of that later, but there's fonts and icons that you can use to build software. There's frameworks which give you a template to start from when you're building code, so you don't have to repeat the same thing every time. CodeIgniter and Angular are examples of frameworks. They are built in programming languages and they give you a lot of standard functionality that you can modify. And those frameworks are open source themselves as well. And then there's, in a similar way, there's for platforms and software development kits. So they give you access to platform-specific features. Even if the platform is closed, the SDK gives you access to it. So that open development means that you allow other people to contribute and build on your software. So Windows, even though Windows itself is not open source, does have an SDK, which means that you can build on it and you can, in your software, you can use certain features or access certain parts of the system. Same goes for Android. DirectX was an example of that as well, specifically for games. Another way that often nowadays is being used, especially when you talk about web development, is the use of libraries. So those are general pieces of code for a specific feature that you can integrate in your application. So you can take that library and you don't have to write certain algorithms or functions. Other people have already written it for you. A leaflet is an example for making web map-based applications, for example, in JavaScript. And there is many around them. To give you an example of what companies do, this is you may or may not have heard about the Twitter Bootstrap. And if you've not heard about it, you might have recognized it. So Bootstrap is a combination of a style, a layout, combined with some code that is made to make responsive websites. So websites that work well on mobile devices as well as on your desktop or on your laptop. And Bootstrap makes it very easy for developers to build these websites. They don't have to think about all the layouts and all the code that is needed to make these responsive websites. They can just take that code, load it in, and start adding their own content and their own code to it. So you might recognize, if you go to some websites, that they have a sort of similar style. That is the Bootstrap, and it was developed by Twitter. It's made open source and it's publicly available as well. So even though you might not know Bootstrap, that is an example of open source development where people contributed to it, made it publicly available, and other people can build on it. Another example which is interesting is the Chromium. So you might know the browser Chrome, but Chrome is built on a piece of code called Chromium. And Chromium is actually the open source version. Is an open source developed browser. So it means the source code is available, it's being actively maintained, developed, and that source code is then being used by companies to build their own browsers. To give you an idea, Chromium is the basis for things like Brave, Edge, Opera, and Chrome. So all these companies, Microsoft, Google, others that are building these browsers, they use the open source software and the open source code from Chromium, and they're actively contributing to it. In fact, you will probably see the likeness here between the icon of Chrome and the icon of Chromium, because Google has been a big contributor to this. So if you don't want to use Chrome and all the Google add-ons, but you want a clean open source version, you can install Chromium. It will give you a lot of the same functionalities, and it's open source compared to Chrome, which takes some of the code, but Chrome itself is not open source. So why, if you have all these wonderful tools and you can build your own software, why would you not do it? Well, there's a couple of reasons that people still acquire software from other companies or outsource some of the software development. First of all, you need staff to do it. So your information systems development, if you're a small company, it can put a lot of strain on your company. So unless it's part of your strategy, you might want to use your human resources, the resources you have, in a different way, and it might be better to outsource it. You might have some information system staff, you might have some developers, but for example, their skill set is limited compared to the project requirements or the size of the project. People might not have time. Usually people are already busy in companies they're working, so they won't have time to develop everything. And same for performance, these things. So if you don't have the skill set, you don't have the staff, it might be too risky, which could be also a reason to outsource things. You could do either buy a prepackaged system that could be configured to your needs, or you outsource the complete development. So let's take a look at those options. So if you're gonna acquire a system, especially if it's a large one, there's probably a lot of companies that can offer you, to build a website, to build a ERP system within your company, or whatever you need. So one of the things you could do that is close to like making a tender for a government is write up a request for proposal. So you're asking other companies, give me a proposal on how you would tackle this problem. And you can use your business case and all the work you've done so far to make that request for proposal. It will summarize what you already have so that a developer will know, what kind of tools is your staff used to, what kind of system should we integrate with. You could look at the requirements. What features do you need? What does the system need in terms of performance? How many people should use it? How often, and so on. How critical is the system? How reliable does it need to be? How many backups do we need? And so on. And then you would also list the requirements. How are you going to judge? Probably one of the requirements is going to be the costs that you're going to look at, the reputation of a company, and so on. So what criteria will you use to compare these proposals? because that will tell the person writing you a proposal what they should mention in their proposal. And of course, time and budget constraints. And we'll come back to that a bit later, because there is a strong relationship between your quality, your scope, your time, and your budget. So that's sort of the steps when you develop a proposal. Now, what is some of the criteria that you can use, and what is the reason you would outsource is, you can request other people to develop things for you, but outsourcing means that you're completely handing over the information system development to somebody else. That will, for example, it can save you costs, because if you ask other people to develop, it might be daily business for them, so they're more efficient at it, means that they can develop at a lower cost. Vendors might have more reputation, they might be reliable, they might be consistent. If you use systems from Microsoft, they've been around for years, they've been well tested. You might even, because of pressure, accept somebody else's systems that they've been offered. Your company might not have the right competencies, so you're focusing on what you can do well as a company, which might not necessarily be information systems development. So it's better to ask a company that does have it as a core competence. Well, we already mentioned financial. There could be internal politics. So sometimes it is a good reason to ask a consultant or an external company to do things for you, because they're perceived as more neutral. It might be that if somebody is presenting a business case within the company, people might see it as a threat or as elbowing or trying to climb the ladder. By having an external company bring in, they're more neutral. They can say things, they can wonder about things, they can ask questions, and not be involved too much in the internal politics. But one of the things that you have to be careful for is what we call the golden handcuffs. As soon as you start outsourcing it, whether you buy prepackaged software or you hire external developers, it means that you are creating a dependency on somebody else. You will not have as we mentioned, you will not have the skills, you will not have the people in-house to make the changes, unless you implement that. And it means you're going to be stuck. So we call that the whole golden handcuffs, because in the beginning it's wonderful, it looks great, but as you start needing maintenance, if you start needing updates, you start making upgrades, you have to go back to that supplier all the time. And actually, a lot of times, the maintenance, the renewal of contracts, the changes are the things that are the most costly. The initial development might be, as expected, might be some extra features, but once you're locked into that system, you need to use it. There could be even additional, like Microsoft, once you have Windows, it makes sense to use Office. Once you have Office, it makes sense to use Outlook, an Exchange server. Then it becomes very convenient because it works well together to use Microsoft Teams, and so on. So you get like a vendor lock, and along with the golden handcuffs. So next thing you know, your choices are limited and you're stuck. That does not mean that necessarily it's a bad thing. It just means something you have to be aware of. Once you start entering into a contract with a supplier or a vendor, think about the long term, about how dependent do you want to be on that provider, and how much are you willing to pay to reduce that dependency. So let's move on to the next step. So you have all these options, you can evaluate. So the next thing you do, once you have all these options, you can either outsource it, you can build it yourself, you've explored all these options. It's time to start valuing these alternatives. You've identified you have a bike, you might use the car, you have a train. So you need to start thinking about which one of these options is the best one. And that's not an easy thing to do, because it will depend on some perspectives you have. It depends on your decision maker. There could be side effects, but you need to check at least certain things. Is it feasible? Is this a viable option? Is it realistic? Can I afford it? So there's different ways that you can look once you've identified your alternatives, from building it yourself, from buying prepackaged software or outsourcing it completely. How do you value them? So you might look at systems documentation. You might try a system, look at the performance, and you can look at the criteria you have listed in your business case to see how well each option outweighs those criteria. So one of the benchmarks you could use is like what's the time of response, time needed, how fast is the system, how quickly can I get access to the information I need, how well, how long does it take a user to get familiar with the system, and so on. So commonly when you look at evaluating proposals that are being brought in, you can look at different criteria, and you can use these even when you're asking people to send you a proposal. So a criteria could be, the reputation of the manufacturer. Do they have experience in this field? What is the, in terms of reliability? How well does how well will the system integrate into what we're already using? How easy is it for users to transition from an old to a new system? What about my warranty, and so on? So here is a set of example criteria that you could use to evaluate your options and, for example, the proposals that have been sent to you. If you want to be more calculated about it, one way to do it would be a weighted multi-criteria analysis. That actually means that you're going to assign scores, relative scores, to each of them. So if you look at this example, on the left-hand side here, you will see requirements. Let me take a pen. So here are so here are the requirements and constraints. So those are my criteria. Those are the things that I want to keep an eye on. Then I've decided weights for each of them. How important is each criteria? So 18 means it's quite important, 14 is less important, and then the costs, and then the ease of training is 5. So you divide like 100 score across each of the requirements, giving the highest weight to the criteria you consider in your case to be the most important one. So eventually you're gonna give each alternative, the alternative could be develop something yourself, could be outsourcing it, could be one vendor A, vendor B, and so on. So each alternative will get a ranking or rating for their proposal. How easy is the web interface? What's the security situation? Does it have business intelligence capabilities? So if you do that for each alternative and you multiply that with the weight, so 5 times 18 reaches 90, 1 time 18, 18, 1 time 14, 14. So you calculate it and then you sum it up. You will find which alternative is the best one. And in this case, alternative C has the highest score of 430. So that is a very deliberate and calculated way of valuing the alternatives and making a decision. It's not something you should blindly follow, but it could help you in, if you have a lot of options, if you have a lot of criteria, to map it out in a spreadsheet like this or on a piece of paper, because it will clearly show you, which things you consider to be important and which alternatives addresses that importance to you. Okay, so once you've decided that that is the alternative you want to go with, that's the system or that's the vendor or you're going to do it yourself, once you've decided that, it becomes time to start implementing it. And that's what we're going to take a look at next.